Централізацію, шлях, який пройшла Латвія і який дуже корисний був би Україні, адже реформа децентралізації є однією з базових, з якої варто починати в Україні взагалі реформування. Тож я хочу
should start the reforms in Ukraine. I would like to give the floor to Vyacheslav Negoda, Deputy Minister of the Regional Development of Ukraine. Good afternoon, esteemed colleagues. We welcome you all at our briefing. The topic that we'll be discussing today is very important for the system of local self-governance. Before we move to the draft law that we'll be discussing, before we talk about Latvian experience, I would like to say that the issue of local self-governance is one of the priority issues in the activity of the government. You know that back in April this year, the government approved the concept of reforms of local self-governance and territorial organization of authorities, and we continue this work today with one objective, so that we can create efficient authorities, local authorities. And we mean the local authorities, territorial bodies of executive power, territorial administration, so that they are capable of local development. Because any changes, any reforms, they should be directed first of all to addressing the problems which exist at the local level. And it is important for us to create the efficient system at the level of territorial communities. Today, territorial communities, especially at the level of village or settlement councils, there are, of course, problems in the cities, in the system of local self-governance, but they all are in the situation which requires radical changes. The government is making attempts to change the system of funding, decentralization of funding, financing, change of tax system, change of other legislative acts. These are the steps that we need to make before we introduce changes, amendments to the Constitution. This will be the second part of reforms, and it will depend on how quickly the Parliament will be able to implement all the changes. But in any case, we are very much interested in territorial communities which are able to address their problems. The government has proposed some draft laws. One law is the law on cooperation of territorial communities, which allows to unite resources, organizational resources, financial, material resources, to address joint problems which exist in some territories. And the second draft law, which is in the Parliament today, is the draft law on voluntary uniting of territorial communities, which will allow territorial communities to unite their resources, creating new territorial communities, new bodies of local self-governance, to be more efficient, more capable in addressing all these problems. The two regulatory acts, the two draft laws, are directed towards support of the development and activity of territorial communities. It is not just about small territorial communities, but in general about the whole system of territorial communities, because it's very important for us to create a territorial foundation which will allow to efficiently act for these communities. And also we are trying to use the experience of the countries which have already had this experience. If we did it before, earlier, we wouldn't have the situation that we are having today. The countries which are moving ahead, the countries with which we were in the same camp, the Baltic states, Poland, Slovakia, other countries, they were not thinking long, they were not discussing long how to call it commune, gmina, community. They made a decision and they started moving ahead. We had long discussions, and today we are in this situation when we have to immediately make decisions and address the problems which have accumulated. So the experience that other countries have today, we are trying to apply it. The experience of Poland, of other countries, and quite recently our group of experts, of representatives of local self-governance were studying the Latvia's experience, and we have the representatives of Latvia today with us, who will try to explain how this is all happening in their country. We have the Association of the Village Councils. We have a leading expert. I will not introduce all of them. They will introduce themselves. So we are very much interested in having these discussions. We're interested in the information about what our ministry is doing, what our government is doing, what's done in other countries, so that this information is given to territorial communities, so that they become more, that they come up with the initiative and they use the instrument which exists and they support the steps and reforms which we are trying to make. Mr. Schulz, I believe you have something to say because you have quite successful experience. How were you addressing the problems of decentralization? Good afternoon. I'm happy that I can share the experience with my friends in Ukraine of implementing territorial reforms. What I would like to say, first of all, the first reform we have implemented after we got independence, we immediately rejected the system of village councils. The system didn't work. And then in 1993, we adopted the concept of reform of self-governance, and that was a comprehensive system that included legal reforms, financial reforms, administrative territorial reforms. That all these reforms were to be completed by 1995. That was the plan. But the legal reforms and financial reforms, we did them during 4 or 5 years. And only in 2009 we completed the territorial reform. In the beginning we had approximately 600 self-governance bodies, and now we have 119 of them. And what we can say is that we now have big opportunities. We did not have such opportunities in the past. And those who were doubting about the reform now, it's difficult to find someone who would say we shouldn't have been implementing such a reform, because the self-governance has improved and the quality of services has improved. The concentration of financial resources allowed us to implement the projects about which we could not even be dreaming in the past. So this whole process gave us a lot of opportunities in self-governance. So I request Anatolyi Tkachuk to tell us how we can use this experience in Ukraine, because we were in the same camp. Good afternoon, dear friends. I would like to say that that was probably my initiative to go to Latvia for the conference where we heard the experience from our Latvian colleagues, and we went to see how it was happening in reality. Let's recollect, why do we need it? When people are talking about decentralization, we need to understand that it is not the process which is important, but the result. We need all people everywhere to live better, to get better, so that they get better services, so that the system of authorities is clear, and it should be responsible to people. What do we need to get in the result of the reform? We need to receive the opportunity to elect authorities which will be addressing the problems, because very often we elect authorities at different levels and we do not get what we expect. And the authorities say, okay, we don't have a single opportunity to satisfy your needs. The reform has to create the authorities which will have a desire to address problems, and if they do not want it, then we can replace them even without Maidan. Now let us look at Latvia and Ukraine. In Latvia, they have more than 60,000 square kilometers. We have 600,000 square kilometers. They have 2 million people. We have 45 million people. But we are very much alike. And we are very much alike, not just because Ukrainian and Latvian folk songs have similar melodies, but look at that table. In 1993, in Latvia, the concept of reform of local self-governance was approved. Here in 2009, the concept was approved, and in 2011 it was cancelled. In 2014 it was approved again. in Latvia in 1998, the law on administrative territorial reform was approved in 2009. 10 years later, the law was implemented. In 2005, we started for the first time talking about the necessity of the reform. In 2014, we received in coalition agreement one sentence which gives us hope that the reform will be implemented, also 10 years. If we look at how Latvian reform was moving, we will see that there was a cardinal change of local self-governance in order to strengthen their capacities and the numbers of the local self-bodies was reduced 5 times. What do we need to take from Latvian experience? I put down many things, and I believe in a month we will publish a book, but what do we have here? First, our objective is to implement reform, it will be implemented, despite the opposition from different groups. Our colleague said that about dozens of ministers were changed, but the reform was implemented, irrespective of whether there is an opposition or not, or resistance. The main engine for reform should be the ministry. Now we have this ministry in Ukraine. Third, in the sectoral ministry, there should be the person for whom implementation of reform is not just the duties but the mission in life. If there's no such a person or such an engine, it's difficult to hope that we will be successful. Fourth, despite the logic of the reform, the logic of schemes, of maps, of powers, there's always the risk that politicians will introduce some changes and the change will not be to the better. 5, if we hope that we can implement reform voluntarily, we can just hope for that. Our colleagues demonstrated what they were doing to stimulate unification. They were paying more, they were increasing privileges, but the process was not dynamic. One more thing which is very interesting and could be used today in our country is our Latvian friends refused from the idea of uniting Volosty into one big Volosty and the new amalgamation was called Krai, and that was perceived better, but at the level of Volosty that were united, they left the centers where some limited services are provided, and these are the services which are required in these small territories which got united. If you look at the map of the Latvia before they were united, it looked like that. Many, many small Volosts. After they all merged, the map looks like that. And then you can make a conclusion that probably they failed to achieve everything because some of small units, they failed to make them large. I don't know whether you see it, but it's Madonsky Krai, where there are two krais smaller than Madonsky Krai. We visited all of them, the smaller one, the bigger, and the biggest one, and we could see how the concentration of resources allows to move to a different level.
Це цікавий будиночок. який був побудований в одній із волостей, маленькій волості, яка об'єдналася. Там 300 осіб було.
They have 300 people there. It was impossible to heat it and or repair it. It was sold. And they added some more money, and they created a functional center. This is the way it looks inside and from outside. There is one person who represents the leadership of this land or region. There is a person who's working with with children, and also a library with broadband internet, and the hall. People can get for a wedding, for funeral, and also there is a kitchen there. So instead of a village council, they created a center, and everything is around it. And on the second floor, there is a small playroom for kids, and they can play some games there. Next slide, please. Here's the biggest land or region, Madonna, is like for 20,000 people, and 8,000 in the central town. This is the sports facility, just one hall, and there could be 2 basketball teams playing at the same time. I was trying to find out from the mayor how they could support it, how much that could be. He was against paying it. A euro and a half for a kid, and €4 for adults. And one more slide I wanted to show. This kindergarten in Madonna region, and a pool, and many other things we could see. So they moved to a new quality, and there is a chance to get additional resources, internal and from EU also. Some more things. What we need to remember, and to remember for us, in Latvia, they don't have mid-level administrative units as a district. And when they are divided, there is, because of absence of such a level, it's impossible to do decentralization, because the small regions, they cannot provide all the services like in big regions. When people say that we don't need administrations, and they refer to countries where they don't have them, Latvia is the country that doesn't have state administration on the district and regional level. But a ministry controls local self-governance as it is provided. It should be done by local administrations. One more thing. We saw that lands or regions that are created around towns, they are more capable than just a union of the same. So our idea on building new units of growth was proven by Latvian experience, and that in Latvia they have 21 centers of growth around which they will concentrate their development. So instead of a conclusion, the logic of a reform prepared in Ukraine is very like in Latvia. The level of details of some parts of this reform is not worse, and in some cases it's maybe even better. Enemies of reform or opposition to reforms in Ukraine are social political groups like in Latvia. But there is one main difference. The guarantor of reforms in Latvia, political parties in the parliament, and they found an agreement not only in the coalition, but also they agreed with the opposition to move the reform on. I will finish with that. Thank you. These are space technologies with Latvian village, but I would like that Mykola, maybe Mykola could share his opinion how realistic that is for us in Ukraine. Good afternoon. It was I was pleased to go to Latvia, and it's a great pleasure to visit that country. And I see the changes for better. I have to be honest. They were very hospitable. They received us, and they showed everything they have. And they paid attention to those mistakes they committed, because the situation was very similar, like in Ukraine. But they decided to reform a long time ago. They are far away ahead of us, and they have great results. And what you saw on this slide, you saw the level on which they have sport, kindergartens. They also have a problem with demography, but they do everything possible to stop, to keep the people in rural areas, and also to give a chance to older people to live well and to realize themselves, even though they are old. It's a great pleasure when you see how people paint, do some crafts even in small towns. They have a very high level of art and crafts on the village level. They have choirs, they have museums, they have schools and kindergartens. Of course, we need a political will. Now, luckily, the situation is better in our country. There will be a ministry responsible for this, and now we clearly see what we will do. We will work under that Ministry of Regional Development, and of course we'll cooperate with the Ministry of Agriculture, because agriculture is very important for our villages, and that's a big issue. Strategic, we don't have strategic documents. The development of territories is not clear, so it's important to approve the laws which were mentioned here. For us to start working without waiting for amendments in the constitution. Ukraine is in a very difficult situation, social, economic, and the war in the east. As to the essence of reforms, we were interested. There was a village mayor, and there were three of us. And the work of we were from local self-governance. And once they had 26 districts before the reform, they studied all problems on the local level. Then they considered all of that, and they developed. They suggested to unite voluntarily, but not everybody agreed, and then the state encouraged that financially, but again, not all agreed, and only after the third additional finances, funding, every community received very good state support to unite, 280,000 euro. So in such for 152 million, that allowed to improve the infrastructure of villages like roads, water, utilities, kindergartens. And it's clear that people understood that they have to unite, and then instead of, and also they received powers to the basic level. They created 109 lands. And those towns and cities like that are bigger than 25,000, and they started cities of state importance and of state status, and nobody united again around them. But those towns like Madonna for 8,000 and others, where they saw that people come to work there, that allowed them to unite. And then they introduced the loan cooperation, it was not working well at the beginning. Then they had money and they could bring money together and to develop. They started to develop business. We saw a small milk factory. They produce milk products and that are loaded into fridges and sent to Germany and to Hamburg. And they developed local enterprises and local business that allows to involve people to participate in the development of their territories. Latvia looks like our Police. They have small settlements and dying villages. It's not a big tragedy. They don't make a big tragedy because somebody would come and work later. And we're interested in those local communities and how many people work and what do they do and how they develop their plans. For us, it's not enough to unite. You need to develop to make a development plan and approve it on the national, on the regional level, and then to supply documents. But political will is at the base, and also material support of such unions. Then, since 2005 up to 2008, they were able to do that, and they developed. But they, since here, they told you don't copy and paste everything because your country is a big country, a huge territory. You have your own values in different regions, so you have to protect all of that and culture and art, and then you can develop a mind of people, and you can encourage people to join NGOs and to be active. There is a lot to learn. We are very thankful to Mr. Garnis because he took us everywhere. He showed everything, and he asked also leaders of those communities to cooperate with us. They are open for cooperation, and on the level of village communities, we could go and learn their experience. We have a lot of work to do. We are late, many years late. If we signed the association agreement with Europe, and then we have to comply with the requirements of EU. We need to involve investments, and we need to involve grants to solve different problems. We have to be ready for that. So that's why the association sees as the main goal to organize training for our leaders, village activists, leaders, who can learn and who can successfully lead their communities. How we unite 1 to 3 or 1 to 2, 11,000. That's so we'll decide which formula to use. Maybe we'll have 1 to 3, 1 to 4, but that's the way to take. And experience of Poland, Slovakia, and our post-Soviet and Moldova shows that that's the way to choose. Thank you very much. Is there any question? I have several questions. First of all, the question to Mr. Schulz. And tell me, please, can you give a very short lesson or conclusion how to overcome opposition in political opposition who don't want decentralization? When you had to reform decentralization, probably there was opposition to that. How did you succeed to overcome that? Which advice could you give to Ukrainian politicians for them to use that experience? The most important is this is a reform for people of Latvia. It's important to provide quality service and to have very good infrastructure. Latvia is interesting because we don't have a problem with the decentralization. We had a problem with that local self-governance were not able to use that function. So that's why we had a legal reform at the beginning, which from 1994 to 1997. If we did like Lithuania, all the reform in 1994, 1995, we wouldn't have a problem at all. But administrative territorial reform, as the concepts were developed and the law was passed only in 1998. In the first law, it said that the reform should be finished by 2004. But nothing happened that year because the law was very bad. Everybody thought that local self-governance would unite by itself. But it happened that in that time, from 550 local self-governance, only 30 united. To finish that reform, everybody got used to it. Administrations of regions, politicians, they didn't want that reform. Maybe people wanted. We told, we were present, and they understood that it's beneficial for them. Then we were laughing at ourselves because the financial support was quite big. But look, if we paid to politicians 100 times less, so money solved everything, and a seat they could lose. And the first law from 1998 was bad, and then that process started. That reform could be done in 1995. I envy Lithuania. They did their reform without money, and then they had some mistakes, but they corrected. And all the rest, the way they have a district level in Estonia. As we also want to have, like Anatolyi told you, that map is quite interesting. All self-governance is developing. But for ideal, we need to make one more step to have it. And we're not afraid we'll do that because even in Europe and in Denmark, when they had the reform, it took them 30-40 years, and they had 3 stages, so everything will be fine. Anatoly, could you add? You studied that experience. How did this succeed to do that? Only money? What can we take and use? Not money, of course. Not money. The issue is they got used to the necessity to have reform, because as I understand, after decentralization there was an issue. You are responsible for a school, but you have not enough of children in a school. You have to agree with someone else. You have to pay to the next community for that school, and your people will ask why our children should study in that school. We are paying for that. Maybe education is bad there. So this internal process, every time they brought them to the necessity to unify services, and also they wanted to understand who is responsible for what. And the most important, there was an ideologist of reforms, and politicians finally understood that step should be taken, and that dialogue inside of politics, among politicians. We spoke to the committee, and this is their communication is on the highest level, because people know everything. The majority of them, they went through local self-governance and or through ministries, so they are very professional. Very professional. People can agree much quicker. I have a question to Mr. Negoda. As to financial decentralization, we had Yuri Goroshak. He told everything is bad, everything is in disaster. Will they be able to agree with Ministry of Education? What are the prospects of that process? I will continue answering the previous question. They had some risks. We have some risks. We need to agree with. We need to find consensus among politicians, and we need to work on the local level. Some don't understand. Some will disagree with the reform. But the first task of our ministry, as Anatoly says, ideology of reforms and decentralization of local self-governance, it should start with one, it should come from one place for us not to have different interpretations, because when someone says what kind of administrations we should have, and then different public servants see it differently, and everybody gives a different interpretation, then there is a mess. Nobody can understand anything. So, and politicians of the national level and on the local level, they don't understand each other. So we need clear messages. If we see that there are groups, political groups, or social groups that don't understand or don't agree with this, our task, and also with your assistance, because to see everyone physically is almost impossible. So it's very important to organize media support to these reforms. One of our tasks, because of the new parliament, and this parliament, in my opinion, has new deputies, and they are progressive. We have a pro-European constitutional majority in the parliament, and if it is really so, and if you read the coalition agreement, there is a paragraph on decentralization and local self-governance. It was prepared well. I mean, that part we are discussing today, and it's important to implement it. And it's great that yesterday, approving the program of the government, they finally made the decision that an appendix or to the work of the parliament, there should be this coalition agreement is compulsory for the government. As to a disaster in decentralization of finances, I think not, because the position of the government on this issue is the budget for 2015 must be approved on the new tax and budget base. So there should be different budget relations, and these are two draft laws that were developed by experts in our ministry and with the participation of the Ministry of Finances. Despite all their shortcomings, it's a big step forward. And what is important, that our ally in this financial reform, the first time in many years, the Minister of Finances is our ally. It's very important that they have finally people who believe that we must run financial decentralization. Some ministries don't agree with the idea that if we have a ministry, it is responsible for state policy in its field, in its sector. For example, Ministry of Healthcare, and They agree with those changes we suggest. Ministry of Education. It's in their companies to deal with not only with universities but also of all the system, preschool education and secondary school, vocational schools, and everything. So when we say that the Ministry of Education should work on these issues, and they should also work on how to get finances for education, then they have questions. We wouldn't. I don't suggest them to do it like in Poland. They have a separate ministry which deals only with schools, and they're responsible for the policy in that field, on that level. We want that policy down to kindergarten. We want our education ministry to work on that, for them to understand the standards, conditions to have in our schools, because it includes not only textbooks, and we change them every year. It includes all the system. It will help us. It will help us to change a lot. That's why we're optimistic about changes. We don't have a different choice, and 2015 should be the first step for decentralization of finances. And the budget should be approved on the new principles. It's an assignment for the parliament, for the government, and also for the society. Thank you very much for your attention. And we're done, and our time expired. If there is any question, you can come up to experts. And thank you very much. I hope that in 2 months we'll speak about concrete results. We want these draft laws there to be approved and used. Thank you very much for your attention.